I have the honour of welcoming you to this presentation on behalf of the elders of the Gadigal and Wangal peoples of the Sydney Basin, and my name is Deborah Lennis. I'm a proud Dharawal woman, a local elder, and I'm the cultural advisor at Inner West Council. The Sydney Basin is bordered by the three rivers of the Hawkesbury River to the north, Nepean to the west, and Georges to the south. Within those lands, 29 different languages are spoken. Birawagal Naninya Birawagal, Gadigalwan Yaranai Gara, Dai Narayarang Guragal, Yanganan Nangun Birawagal Barongni, D Nai Nara, Ni Naranaban Nangun Warren, Nawe Nangubai, Nangana Ganana Banana Warawa, Birawagal Naninya Birawagal. Welcome everyone, welcome. These presentations have been presented and done on the lands of the Gadigal and Wangal peoples here of the Sydney Basin. This land is and always will be Aboriginal land, as we've never ceded sovereignty over it. However, we do lend this land to you to live, work, rest, play and learn. So on behalf of Inner West Council and the elders of the Gadigal and Wangal peoples, we say Birawagal Naninya Birawagal. Welcome everyone, welcome to these presentations. These are Aboriginal studies for teachers years 7 to 10. This one's the Aboriginal Site Studies of Self-Determination and Autonomy, with a core part in history. Protocols for collaborating with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and engaging with cultural work. Teachers should work in partnership with elders, parents, community members, cultural knowledge holders, or a local, regional or state Aboriginal education consultative group. It is important to respect elders and the roles of men and women. Local Aboriginal peoples should be invited to share their cultural knowledges with students and staff when engaging with Aboriginal histories and cultural practices. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are advised that this PowerPoint may contain names, works and images of Aboriginal peoples who are deceased. Aboriginal Self-Determination and Autonomy, the Modern World. 1965 Freedom Rides. Australia had an increasing awareness of the terrible conditions in which many Aboriginal people lived, especially around the edges of country towns and the discrimination that these people suffered. A group of University of Sydney students had formed into a body called Student Action for Aborigines, SAFA, in 1964, to plan a trip and to ensure there was media coverage. Charles Perkins, an Arunti and Kalkadoon man born in Alice Springs, was a third-year art student at the university and was elected president of the SAFA. February 1965, the Students for Action for Aborigines, led by Charles Perkins and Jim Spiegelman, organised a bus tour, the Freedom Rides, which covered the western and coastal towns in New South Wales. Their purpose was threefold. The students planned to draw public attention to the poor state of Aboriginal health, education and housing. They hoped to point out and help lessen the socially discriminative barriers which existed between Aboriginal and white residents. They also wished to encourage and support Aboriginal peoples themselves to resist discrimination. The Freedom Rides visited 11 towns in 15 days. They left Saturday, the 12th of February, from Gadigal country, Sydney, went to Wiradjuri country, Wellington, then Waiwan country, Galagambone. Then they went to the border of Waiwan and Gamilaroi country at Walgett, Gamilaroi country, Moree. Then they went to a border of Bamigabul and Gamilaroi at Bogabila. marble at Tennerfield, back to Gamilaroi country in Moree, then onto a border country of Bunjalung and Gummungia at Grafton, then on to Bunjalung country at Lismore and Cabbage Tree Island, back to Gummungia country at Barraville, then on to Dungutty at Kempsey, Biripi at Taree, and then returning on the 26th of February to Gadigal country, Sydney. In the towns, Aboriginal people were routinely barred from clubs, swimming pools and cafes. They were frequently refused service in shops and refused drinks in hotels. The students demonstrated against racial discrimination practiced at the Walgett Return Services League.
All the members of the RSL had to pass right past us, and they read the banners. They either laughed at us or spat on us or on the banners. Some of them got banners and tore them up. Some of the local smarties wanted to bash or fuel us up. They said, "You're stirring up trouble. The dirty niggers don't deserve any better, and they're happy where they are." Charles Perkins.
The students also protested at the Moree and Kempsey Baths and the Barraville Cinema. They not only challenged these practices, but they ensured that their protests were covered by the media, bringing the issue of racial discrimination to a nation and international press attention, and stirring public debate about the disadvantage and racism facing Aboriginal people across Australia at the time. Angry discussions broke out everywhere. I've never met such hostile, hate-filled people. The hostility seemed to be directed at us as university students, intruders, rather than the Aborigines. Anne Cothroy's an activist as on the SAFA. 1966 Gurindji strike, Wave Hill Station, Northern Territory. The Gurindji people had lived on their homelands in what is now the Victoria River area of the Northern Territory for tens of thousands of years. In 1883, the colonial government granted almost 3,000 square kilometres of their country to the explorer and pastoralist Nathan Buchanan. In 1884, 1,000 cattle were moved onto the land, and 10 years later, there was 15,000 cattle and 8,000 bullocks. This put incredible pressure on the environment, and the system of land management that the Gurindji had developed over many millennia started to break down. This pattern was repeated across Australia as pastoralists took up possession of First Nations lands and stocked them with cattle and sheep. From 1913, legislation required that in return for their work, First Nations people in the Northern Territory should receive food, clothes, tea, and tobacco. The Buchanan family had sold what was then called Wave Hill Station to the international British meatpacking company Vestey Brothers in 1914. 1959, the ward's employment regulations set out a scale of wages, rations and conditions applicable to wards employment in various industries. However, some companies even refused to pay their First Nations labourers anything. At Wave Hill Station, the deferment of the Commission's ruling about paying wages and the refusal of the Vestey brothers to pay First Nations wages led to heated discussions. Through 1966, no progress was made in negotiations, and the Gurindji community, led by Vincent Langari, walked off the station on the 23rd of August.
I've been thinking, it's been Gurindji country. We've been here a longer time before them Vestey mob.
In April 1967, The Gurindji moved their camp 20 kilometres away to Darragung, Waddy Creek. This was a symbolic shift away from the cattle station and closer to the community sacred sites. The Gurindji were focused on reclaiming their lands, while the Unionists believed the dispute was solely about wages and work conditions. The Gurindji stayed on at Darragung, even though, under Australian law, they were illegally occupying a portion of the 15,000 square kilometres leased to the Vesti brothers. Negotiations with the station owners, the International Food Company, Vesti brothers, broke down, leading to a 9-year dispute. In March 1973, the original Wave Hill lease was surrendered and 2 new leases were issued, one to the traditional custodians through their Murrumala Gurindji Company and the other to Vesti brothers. In August 1975, Prime Minister Whitlam came to Darragung and ceremoniously returned a small portion of the Gurindji land to their traditional owners by pouring a handful of soil into Vincent Langari's hands with the words, "Vincent Langari, I solemnly hand you these deeds as proof in Australian law that these lands belong to the Gurindji people." Prime Minister Whitlam. The Gurindji strike was instrumental in heightening an understanding of the First Nations land ownership in Australia. In September 2020, the Gurindji claim for native title to Wave Hill Station. It was granted 54 years after the walk-off that helped to spark Australia's First Nations land rights movement. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have always protested and fought against injustices. There was no single moment that sparked the 1967 referendum, more a growing swell of support for change led by a range of people and organisations. When the Constitution first came to being in 1901, there were only 2 parts that referred to First Peoples of Australia. Section 51.14 gave the Commonwealth the power to make laws with respect to people of any race other than the Aboriginal race in any state. And Section 127 provided that in reckoning the numbers of people in the Commonwealth or of a state or other part of the Commonwealth, Aboriginal natives shall not be counted. This meant that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people weren't recognised as part of the Australian population. So therefore, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples did not have the same rights as other Australians under the Australian Constitution. Many aspects of the lives that were controlled by various state governments, including the right to vote in state elections, marry whoever they chose, move wherever they chose, own property wherever they chose, be the legal guardian of their own children, receive the same pay for the same work, and drink alcohol. This was due to the state governments. They made the laws particular to their own states. So, if an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person lived in New South Wales, he or she had the right to do some of the things spoken before. If that same person lived in Queensland, they may have none of those rights. On the 27th of May 1967, the Australian government held a referendum in which 90.7% of the Australian voters chose yes to count Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the census and give the Australian government the power to make laws for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. What changed after the 1967 referendum? The referendum result allowed Australian government to change the constitution to be involved in the affairs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Thousands of people worked on the campaign, and achieving the yes was a huge victory, signalling a change in the mindset of Australia's majority. It opened the door to First Nations Australian agencies, bringing to light the many strong leaders and organisations and the expectation that things could be different. Change was possible, and they were only willing to fight for it. In many ways, that fight still continues today. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have been fighting to retain the rights to their traditional lands since British colonisation of the Australian continent. In 1960s and 70s was a period of greater national and international awareness of Aboriginal activism, with significant actions taken by groups in the land rights struggle. On the eve of Australia Day 1972, Prime Minister William McMahon announced the implementation of a new system that rejected granting independent ownership of the traditional lands to Aboriginal peoples in favour of a 50-year general purpose lease. These leases required Aboriginal communities to demonstrate a social and economic use for the land and excluded any mineral or forestry rights. After the ongoing disappointment of the land rights struggle, this announcement sparked action amongst many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups and directly contributed to the founding of the Tent Embassy. After the McMahon government's announcement, many protesters sprang into action, including a group from Redfern in Sydney. 4 members of this group, Michael Anderson, Billy Craigie, Bertie Williams and Tony Corey, drove to Canberra and set up a beach umbrella on the lawns opposite what is now Old Parliament House, labelled the Aboriginal Embassy. Aboriginal activist Gary Foley remarked,
"The announcement positioned Aboriginal peoples as aliens in our own land, so like other aliens we need an embassy."
A visit from the opposition leader Gough Whitlam to discuss their plan for land rights was seen by activists as a great success in gaining recognition for their cause and having their ideas heard by those in positions of power. The embassy grew by April 1972 to include at least 6 tents. It attracted both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples from across the country who joined solidarity over land rights movement. Support shown by official representatives as well as diplomats from the countries including Canada and Russia helped bolster the profile of the embassy. While the embassy enjoyed support, it also faced a large contingent of politicians and members of the public who believed the protesters were trespassing and the tents were an eyesore. Gaining media attention across Australia and internationally, the embassy became a central for protest. Well-known Aboriginal activists, including Gary Foley, John Newfong, Chicka Dixon and Gordon Briscoe, spent time at the site. Between 1972 and 1992, the Aboriginal Tent Embassy was set up in various places across Canberra, including Capitol Hill, where Australia's new Parliament House opened in 1988. Protesters encouraged action on land rights and other Aboriginal issues, including funding, political representation, self-determination and sovereignty. The embassy remains controversial. Many people have challenged its validity and several arson attacks have damaged buildings within the camp. The Aboriginal Tent Embassy is a symbol of Aboriginal protest against successive governments and their approach to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander issues. The most prominent issue being publicised by the embassy continues to be sovereignty over Australia's continent and the acknowledgement of the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to self-determination. Whitlam's 1972 election campaign speech was clear on the need to accord Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples the rights, justices, opportunities that had been denied to them for so long. Under the Whitlam government, a policy of self-determination was adopted, whereby the Commonwealth would support decision-making by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people themselves and relinquish the paternalistic control that previous governments had wielded over the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. He also returned the land to the Gurindji people. He established the Aboriginal Land Fund and the Aboriginal Lands Loan Commission. He established the National Aboriginal Consultative Committee. He drafted the first Land Rights Act. He did anti-discrimination legislation and funded Aboriginal legal services. If you choose to, please listen to From Little Things, Big Things Grow by Kevin Carmody in regards to the Gurindji situation and the return of the lands. 1988 Australian Bicentenary and the Justice, Freedom and Hope March. A bicentenary is a 200th anniversary of a significant event. On the 26th of January 1988, many Australians celebrated the bicentenary of the arrival of the 11 ships of the First Fleet in Botany Bay and Sydney Cove on Bidjigal and Gadigal country. Events held to celebrate this milestone in Sydney included reenactments of the First Fleet's arrival, a parade and concerts. Justice, Freedom and Hope March, at the same time as the bicentenary celebrations, more than 40,000 Aboriginal people and non-Indigenous supporters staged what was at the time the largest march ever held in Sydney. The protest was held because of the colonisation of Australia, which caused injustice, sufferings and dispossession of Aboriginal peoples was being celebrated. At Hyde Park, where the march ended, several prominent Aboriginal leaders and activists spoke. Amongst the speakers was activist Gary Foley, who said,
"Let's hope Bob Hawke and his government gets this message loud and clear from all these people here today. It's so magnificent to see black and white Australians together in harmony. This is what Australia could and should be like."
Protesters drew both national and international attention to Australia's ongoing history of colonisation. It was aimed to educate the public about the poor conditions of Aboriginal health, education and welfare, of the high imprisonment rates and the number of deaths in custody suffered by Aboriginal people. The message was, and still is to this day, white Australia has a black history. While the celebrations focused on the discovery of Australia with a reenactment of the arrival of the First Fleet, the protest was a reminder that Australia has been inhabited by at least 60,000 years before European invasion. The 1992 Mabo decision. Legal proceedings for the case began on the 20th of May 1982 when a group of 4 Miriam men, Eddie Koiki Mabo, Reverend David Pussy, Sam Pussy and James Rice, and 1 Miriam woman, Kalua Mapu Sale, brought an action against the state of Queensland and the Commonwealth of Australia in the High Court, claiming native title to the Murray Islands in the Torres Strait. Eddie Koikumabo was the first named plaintiff, and the case became known as the Mabo case. Justice Moynihan resumed the hearing of the facts in the case presented by Eddie Mabo and the people of Mer, with sittings taking place on Murray Island as well as on the mainland. Justice Moynihan handed down his determination of facts on the 16th of November 1990, which meant the High Court could begin its hearing of the legal issues in the case. On June 3rd, 1992, 6 of the 7 High Court judges upheld the claim and ruled that the lands of this continent were not terra nullius, or lands belonging to no one, when European settlement occurred, and that the Meriam people were entitled as against the whole world to possession, occupation, use and enjoyment of the lands of the Murray Islands. The Mabo case and decision by the High Court of Australia was successful in overturning the myth at the time of colonisation of Australia that it was terra nullius, or land belonging to no one, and it was a significant legal case in Australia that recognised the land rights of the Meriam people, traditional owners of Murray Island, which includes the islands of Mer, Dawa and Waya in the Torres Strait. The High Court recognised the fact that Indigenous people have lived in Australia for thousands of years and enjoyed rights to their land according to their own laws and customs. 12 months later, the Native Title Act 1993, Commonwealth, was passed. 2007 United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The Declaration is the most comprehensive instrument detailing the rights of Indigenous peoples in international law and policy, containing minimum standards for the recognition, protection and promotion of these rights. The Declaration addresses both individual and collective rights, cultural rights and identity, the rights to education, health, employment, language, and others. It outlaws discrimination against Indigenous people and promotes their full and effective participation in all matters that concern them. The High Commission for Human Rights welcomed the adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People by the General Assembly on the 13th of September 2007 as a triumph for justice and human rights dignity following more than 2 decades of negotiations between governments and Indigenous peoples' representatives. United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted by the majority of 144 states in favour, 4 votes against Australia, Canada, New Zealand and the United States, and 11 abstained. Since adoption of the Declaration, Australia, New Zealand, United States and Canada have all reversed their position and expressed support for the Declaration. Colombia and Samoa have also endorsed the Declaration. 2008 National Apology. On the 13th of February 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd offered a formal apology to Australia's Indigenous peoples, particularly the stolen generations, on behalf of the nation at Australia's Parliament House. The national apology is considered a milestone step towards reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. In his apology to Australia's Indigenous people, The Prime Minister, Rudd, made the following statement regarding closing the gaps in social inequalities faced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. This new partnership on closing the gap will set concrete targets for the future within a decade to halve the widening gap in literacy, numeracy and employment outcomes and opportunities for Indigenous children. Within a decade to halve the appalling gap in infant mortality rates between Indigenous and non-Indigenous children. And within a generation to close the equally appalling 17-year life gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous when it comes to overall life expectancy. Following the speeches, Lorraine Peters, Malawan and Gamilla Roy-Person, acting on behalf of the stolen generations present in Parliament House, presented a glass coolamon to then the Prime Minister Rudd and the Leader of the Opposition, Brendan Nelson. The coolamon was made by the Bye Bye Nabarangi, an artist from the Balago community in Western Australia, and it contained a message that said, "On behalf of our people, thank you for saying sorry. In return, we give you this gift on behalf of us affected by being taken away from our families. This is our way of saying thank you. The gift is a glass coolamon, fragile yet strong. Coolamons have carried our children. The gift is a symbol of hope we place in the new relationship with which to forge with our people. A relationship that itself is fragile yet strong. We have a new covenant between our people that we will do all we can to make sure our children are carried forward, loved and nurtured, and be able to live a full life." The National Apology and the coolamon are on display at Parliament House. The Uluru Statement from the Heart. We gathered at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make this statement from the heart. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between the land, or Mother Nature, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom, remain attached thereto, and must one day return to there to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. Please play the YouTube video from Thomas Mayo about the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Local Democracy Group. Inner West Council's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Local Democracy Group, LDG, assists in matters related to services, programs and activities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples living in the local area. The LDG provides feedback, guidance and recommendation to Council on specific issues including strategic planning and policy, contributes to local knowledge regarding community impacts, emerging trends and opportunities and service gaps, supports delivery of NAIDOC Week events and reconciliation activities and celebrations. It also helps shape council policies and documents. Some of the ones that we've done include the Reconciliation Action Plan, the Cultural and Strategic Plan, Heritage and Cultural History. Local elders do welcomes for country, for councils and community events, and there's an Aboriginal design for the council's branding.